All right, let's keep going. We added the 2/7 chord, and we thought that was kind of fun. Let's not let the 5/7 have all the fun here, so let's add another one. And we're going to talk today, or in this video, I should say, about adding the 7/7 chords. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about our diminished seventh chords. Now, we just looked at the 2 chord, which you know in minor is diminished, but it's a little distinct because it doesn't fall on the 7th degree of the scale, which just all of a sudden adds a lot more complexity in. So let's take a peek here. In major keys, 7 is going to be half diminished. So it's, the same thing as we would get on 2 in minor. But in a minor key, we have that fully diminished 7th chord. And as you can imagine, that's going to be the most unique. So one of the things about these chords is that we can start to make some fairly general comments about usage, because we're starting to get a lot of options, right? If you think back to midway through the Theory 1 semester, it probably felt like we had very, very, very few options, right? We had these root position, handful of root position chords, and certain ones wanted to go certain places. Done. Choices were pretty easy. But here, all of a sudden, we've added a bunch of inversions of a number of 7th chords. And we really can start to say, okay, we don't need every chord to do everything, right? We don't need all of our chords to be endlessly versatile because we've got a different chord for that. If you think back to the Theory 1 semester, you will recall that we didn't use the 7 chord in root position because we didn't know what to do about doubling the leading tone, which is the root. Well, now we don't have to double anything because we're going to have a 7th chord on it. So there's 4 distinct notes. But what that means is we can sort of say, okay, well, we've got an option now for root position. So when we've got a 7 chord in root position, we're going to use a 7th. We're going to make it a 7/7 chord, either half diminished or fully diminished. But there's no reason to change what we've been doing in first inversion, which is going to continue to be to use a triad. So pretty much our 2 options with 7 will be 7/7, right? Root position 7th chord, or 7/6, which is the triad in first inversion. It is 100% possible to use, for instance, 7/6/5 chord, and it is of course possible to use a 7 triad in root position, but they don't work as well, and they often come with, sort of little sneaky problems. And so as a broad generalization, trying to sort of, acknowledge the fact that we have a lot more options now so we can be a little bit more purposeful and picky, we're going to use the 7th chord, 7/7, in root position, and the triad 7/6 in first inversion. So that's going to be our general usage here. Now, changing it up again compared to the 2 chord, for instance, we've now again have both a leading tone and a 7th that we need to resolve because, of course, the 7 chord is built on the leading tone. So we sort of have to keep that in mind. And what's going to really be the thing that we find here is that due to this, the doublings that happen on our resolution chord may be a little bit odd from time to time, but resolution of our tendency tones is sort of the priority here. And we sort of often look at these instances in a lesser of 2 evils kind of situation, and the resolution of the tendency tones is the lesser of 2 evils. I know that an odd doubling, like why is the 3rd doubled here, who knows, that may seem like that's the thing to avoid most critically, but the thing that will make the music feel the most sort of natural and give each line the strongest sense of an individual musical purpose is to resolve the tendency tones above all else. And as I mentioned, we're going to just find that with the fully diminished 7 chord, we run into some pretty unique scenarios. So we'll get to that. But in this video, we're going to talk about the half-diminished 7 chord that we get in major. So 7 half-diminished 7th. You'll recall that the way we build this chord is it's a diminished triad, right? Root, minor 3rd, and a diminished 5th. Diminished triad with a minor 7th, right? So we end up with this really nice sort of combination, half-diminished with a minor 7 on top. This is the chord that you would sometimes potentially hear called the 7 flat 5 chord, minor 7 flat 5. We're going to call it half diminished. So this is what we would get in major keys. And we're going to be in B flat major. And so our chord is exactly the one I just played just now, kind of by accident. It's A as the root, C as the 3rd, E flat as the 5th, and G natural the minor 7th, right? So the triad is diminished, A, C, E flat, and the 7th is minor, half diminished. So that's our chord. Let's see what we need to know about it. Of course, it's got that dominant function, right? 7 and 5 are both dominant chords, but this is not a dominant 7th chord. We sort of, again, in music, there are so many terms that get used and reused and mean multiple different things depending on context. Even though the 7 chord is dominant function, this is still a half-diminished 7th chord, right? So the voice leading and the considerations and the spelling there don't change. It just shares its dominant function with the 5 chord. We're seeing here in these examples that it's pretty much going to lead us to a root position 1 chord. That's sort of the best bet for this chord. We can, especially with the leading tone in the bass, right? Where does the leading tone want to go? It wants to resolve. And so this is where we can see that we're actually in very familiar territory, because the leading tone and the 7th are still going to do the things that they've always been doing. The leading tone is going to resolve upwards, T, Do, and the 7th of this chord here in the soprano voice is going to resolve downwards. And we get these really lovely stepwise resolutions for everyone, right? So pretty much that should feel very, very comfortable and straightforward. Resolve your tendency tones, leading tone upwards, 7th downwards. But of course, this is somewhat unique, and so we do need to sort of unpack some of the issues that we might want to be on the lookout for when we're doing this root position 7 half diminished 7. Now, the first one is that if we're not careful, we can, and this is really the main one, we can accidentally run into parallel fifths. And this is something that should make sense because, again, we're dealing with a chord in which 2 of the voices have to go certain places. The leading tone pretty much needs to resolve upwards, and the 7th needs to resolve downwards. And so if we look at this first example, no wonder we got parallel fifths, because the soprano on G is going to move downwards to F. Now, that doesn't mean that the tenor is going re, do, si to B flat. Doesn't make musical sense. It just means that we have to sort of be careful with what's going on, and they need to be aware that though it may individually make sense to go re, do, the parallel fifths can draw too much attention to that, right? They stand out too much. That's the issue with parallel fifths, is that they can just be a little too noticeable compared to the rest of the texture. So this is where that idea of the doublings comes into play. And so what we often will see is that the tenors in this case would just not resolve from re to do. We can see the tenors are going to move upwards So we've got the third of this one chord doubled at the unison between the tenors and the altos. And again, probably don't really notice that that's happening. And the tenors still have a pretty musical line there, and it just avoids us from having those parallel fifths that would stand out a little too much. Now, the other option would be to revoice it. If for whatever reason we really, really badly want the C to go to the B flat, we could certainly revoice this. In this instance, who has the seventh now? Root, third, fifth, seventh in the tenors, and the tenors are gonna resolve from G to F. And so that's parallel fourths, which are a little bit more doable. Right, so again, leading tone up, seventh downwards, and that's what you get. So with your 7 half-diminished seventh chord, make sure you're using it in root position, resolve that leading tone upwards, seventh downwards, and you just need to have some situational awareness for who has a fifth with somebody else, and is that sort of tendency tone-related voice leading accidentally affecting somebody else. So you just have to have a little awareness, and you may have to use a strange doubling, but that's all good. In the next video, we'll talk about the fully diminished seventh chord.